Yeah, India is not in a crisis. Remember that EMs manipulate their exchange rates, and that means their balance of payments drives their cyclical behavior. So all EMs are having a cyclical adjustment through the balance of payments. They became somewhat uncompetitive. They became somewhat overgeared. A crisis is an entirely different thing, and that relates to just how much debt you've got and how much offshore debt you've got, and whether your economic adjustment takes you to a stage either through a lower exchange rate or lower economic activity where you begin to default on the debt, and India is very unlikely to do that. I'm not saying there aren't some Indian corporates who've borrowed too much money who may find themselves in that situation, but we're talking, when we talk about bankruptcy, as we were talking in Asia 98, something systemic across the system which bankrupts a lot of people, and I really don't believe India is there because foreign currency debt or external debt to GDP is 20%. And that's a low level. We should only be concerned about countries above 30. And if we go to Eastern Europe, we're looking at many countries 70, 80 and over 100%. And that's why I think we have to use the word crisis for these countries. But we don't use it for India. We don't use it for Brazil. We don't use it for China. The really big ones have actually got levels which are reasonable. So I'm not for an instant saying that India doesn't have problems. I'm not saying that it isn't going to have a cyclical slowdown like the whole of EM. But the word crisis I think we have to reserve for other countries. And they are primarily in Eastern Europe. Well, I think the all EMs have this issue. When you have manipulated the exchange rate, where do you go from there? So I think there are many positives from India in terms of their policy responses. Just to stress, I don't think those policy responses mean that India returns to higher levels of growth anytime soon. But there's a flexibility in India because the manipulation of the exchange rate was more limited. It hasn't been as aggressive as elsewhere. The RBI has permitted a higher degree of flexibility, which I praised at the time and I think was a very good thing to do. It's created some degree of more variability in the currency, which has persuaded some people at least not to get too aggressively involved in borrowing foreign currencies. And the weakness of the currency we should see as a good thing. I understand the problems that causes for people in India at a very basic level with inflation, but the ability to let the exchange rate adjust is a very positive thing. So of course there has to be some defense of the exchange rate, but when they do, or if they do decide to defend the exchange rate, I don't think it causes as much economic pain in India as it causes everywhere else. So I think there's more flexibility in India because they pursued a much more realistic view on the exchange rate for the last 5 years. So things are going to get tougher in India, but that doesn't mean to say that they have to take the really, really difficult policy options of major internal deflation or very major devaluations. I just don't think the Indian situation is in the same category as we've seen in other EMs. Well, look, my view on the rating agencies is that they just get it wrong in how they consider EM debt. In fact, most people get it wrong. They don't understand the relationship between debt and a fixed exchange rate regime. They don't understand that when you run that type of currency manipulation policy, that you can find yourself in a domestic debt deflation. They don't understand that on it from a global macro perspective, if foreigners own a lot of your domestic debt securities, that can actually be a bad thing and not a good thing. So as I said, India is not perfect, but in the whole it hasn't done as badly as everybody else. It has allowed that currency to produce a flexibility which has dampened some of the more extreme levels that we get to in this. And I think the rating agencies should really be rewarding emerging markets that can live with more flexible exchange rates, because ultimately the imbalances which they throw up are not as bad as the imbalances we get elsewhere. Whether the rating agencies will ever come to that conclusion, I don't know. But perhaps if we did have another major EM debt crisis, particularly in Eastern Europe, they would begin to reevaluate how they award credit ratings in countries with currency manipulation policies, and begin to realize that those who don't manipulate the currencies probably have debt cycles which are not as vicious or dangerous to investors as those that do. So the currency policy in India is still being manipulated, but much better than other EMs, and therefore I think the debt markets ultimately are much lower risk than many emerging market debt markets.